Beneath the vaulted ceilings of Buckingham Palace, where history is woven into the very air, a secret meeting unfolds not found in any official schedule. It is the night before the world descends upon London for a coronation, a moment of dazzling pageantry meant for billions. But here in the private audience room, away from the rehearsing troops and the glittering regalia, the true weight of a crown is being measured, not in jewels, but in whispered debts from the past, a startling confession from an unexpected guest, and a shared, hidden grief that threatens to unravel the careful script of tomorrow. This is the story of the audience they never wanted you to know about, where the future monarch learned that to rule a nation, one must first confront the ghosts it keeps. The final evening before the coronation draped London in a peculiar silence, a city holding its breath. Within Buckingham Palace, the usual hushed efficiency had sharpened into a wire-taut focus. For Alexander, the soon-to-be crowned king, the meticulously planned day had felt like a suit of clothes that did not quite fit. The rehearsals in the Abbey, the weight of the St. Edward's crown in his practiced hands, the waves from the balcony, all were performed with a dutiful precision that masked a deep, private tremor. He stood now not in the glittering ballroom, but in his private study, a room of worn leather and quiet portraits. His reflection in the dark window showed a man in his 40s, the boyish hope long replaced by the etched lines of a life lived in a gilded cage. Tomorrow, he would cease to be Alexander and become His Majesty. Tonight, he felt more like an actor on the eve of a premiere, unsure of his lines. His contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock. Eleanor, his private secretary, entered. Her face, usually a mask of impeccable calm, held a flicker of something else, apprehension. "Sir," she began, her voice low, "the guests for the private audience have arrived. They are being shown to the green drawing room." She handed him a single sheet of paper, not the usual hefty briefing file. On it were just 3 names. His eyes scanned them, and a cold wave of recognition, mixed with profound confusion, washed over him. The first was a name from a shadowy chapter of history, a man he thought was a relic of his grandfather's reign. The second was a global figure of immense, quiet influence, with no formal ties to the crown. The third was a personal ghost, a link to a loss he had spent decades trying to compartmentalize. "This cannot be right," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir Alastair Finch. He must be 100 years old. And why is he here with them?" He pointed to the other 2 names, his finger trembling slightly. Eleanor met his gaze. "The request came through the most discreet channels, sir, sanctioned at the highest level of the household. The instruction was simply that you grant them audience. Alone. No officials, no record. It was presented as a matter of sovereign necessity." The term hung in the air, heavy and archaic. Alexander felt the walls of his predefined future shift. This was not on the schedule. In his world, that was both a terror and a thrill. He walked the long corridors alone, the portraits of his ancestors seeming to watch him with renewed interest. The green drawing room, with its silk walls and serene landscapes, felt like a stage. The 3 guests stood as he entered, a strange and disconnected trio. Sir Alastair Finch was indeed ancient, a parchment-skinned man leaning heavily on an ivory-topped cane, but his eyes, pale blue, were sharp and clear, holding a century of secrets. Next to him was Khalid al-Mansour, a Qatari energy magnate and philanthropist known as the Sultan of Silence for his ability to broker world-altering deals without a single press leak. He was immaculate, calm, a man who existed in the world of private jets and undisclosed accords. But it was the third figure that stole the air from Alexander's lungs. Deir Anya Sharma. She was older now, her dark hair streaked with gray, but her posture, the quiet intelligence in her brown eyes, was achingly familiar. She had been his older sister's closest friend at university, a constant, warm presence in his teenage years. She had been there in the chaotic, horrifying days after the accident that took his sister, a steadying hand in a shattered family. He had not seen her in over 20 years. Her presence here, in this company, was a shock that resonated in his bones. The formalities were brittle. Alexander gestured for them to sit. "Welcome," he said, the practiced royal tone feeling hollow. "I must confess, your joint presence is unexpected. On the eve of such a public day, this private audience is a unique occurrence." It was Sir Alistair who spoke first, his voice a dry rustle, yet commanding. "Tomorrow, you will be given symbols, your royal highness. The orb, the scepter, the crown. Tonight, we are here to give you context, not of the monarchy's public glory, but of its private burdens. We are, in our own ways, keepers of chapters that were deliberately left out of the book." Khalid Al-Mansur inclined his head slightly. "My role is of the present and the immediate future. There is a situation, a nexus of finance, resource security, and regional stability that intersects with the Crown's interests in a manner only such an informal gathering can address. It pertains to the legacy of your grandfather's reign." Anya Sharma said nothing, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked at Alexander not with the deference due to a king in waiting, but with the old, deep sadness of shared history. He found he could not hold her gaze for long. Alexander felt a surge of frustration, cutting through the awe. "Respectfully, this is highly irregular. My grandfather has been gone for 30 years. And Dr. Sharma," he faltered, using her formal title to create distance. "Her expertise is in clinical psychology, not affairs of state." "The state of a man's heart is often the most critical affair of state," Sir Alistair replied, unblinking. "Your grandfather, King Edmund, was my friend. And before he was your grandfather, he was a young man who made a promise during a war that he could not, in peacetime, keep in the way he intended. That broken promise has a name, and it sits in the form of a sovereign wealth fund that now holds a sword of Damocles over this nation's energy independence. Mr. Al-Mansur is the only person who can mediate its safe resolution, but he requires a gesture, a token of good faith from the Crown that is not monetary, but moral." Alexander turned to Khalid. "What gesture?" Khalid's expression was impassive. "A public acknowledgement, at a time of your choosing after the coronation, of a historical partnership. The details are sensitive. It relates to the Al-Hor Project, 1952. Alexander had never heard of it. He looked back at Sir Alistair, the historian of this secret. The old man's next words were softer, aimed with precision. "The promise involved a woman, your royal highness. A nurse from Jamaica who saved your grandfather's life after his plane went down in the Caribbean. He vowed to her a debt of honor. The debt was called in quietly in the early 50s for a project that would secure oil for a rebuilding Britain. The terms were favorable beyond belief, but they were built on that personal oath, not on paper. The current holders of that debt wish for it to be recognized, not repaid. They wish for the story, or a sanctioned version of it, to enter the light." The room seemed to spin. This was not dry history. It was a live wire connected to the present. "And if I refuse this acknowledgement?" Khalid spread his hands, a minute gesture. "The favorable terms dissolve. The impact on energy prices would be severe and immediate. It would be the first crisis of your reign, born from a secret 70 years old." Alexander sank back into his chair. The weight of the unseen crown grew heavier. He then turned to Anya, his voice barely controlled. "And you, Anya? What is your part in this? Are you here to assess my psychological state for this burden?" Anya finally spoke, her voice steady but thick with emotion. "No, Alex." She used his childhood name, and it felt like a key turning in a long-locked door. "I am here because of your sister, because of Eleanor." Hearing her name spoken aloud in this context was a physical blow. "There are things about that night, about the accident, that you were never told. Things your parents, in their own devastating grief, chose to shield you from. I have carried it for 22 years. Sir Alistair, he knew. He helped arrange the containment of the story at the time. My presence here is my own choice. I believe, on the eve of you assuming this immense role, you deserve the full truth of the burdens your own family has carried. You cannot shoulder one legacy without understanding the other. The hook was set. The private audience had become a tribunal of the past. Alexander, the man about to be transformed into an institution, realized he was not being prepared for a ceremony, but for a confession. The foundations of his life, his understanding of history, of the crown's role, and of his own most profound personal loss, were being challenged in a single evening. He looked at the three faces before him: the keeper of a royal secret, the broker of the modern world, and the guardian of a painful truth. The coronation tomorrow was a performance. This was the real anointing, and it was just beginning. A stunned silence enveloped the green drawing room, broken only by the faint, steady tick of a buhl clock. Alexander felt unmoored, as if the finely woven Persian rug beneath his feet had been pulled away. The two revelations, the geopolitical secret and the intimate, familial one, hung in the air, separate yet somehow intertwined by the mere fact of their simultaneous arrival. He was a sailor caught between two sudden, violent storms. "Start with the debt," he heard himself say, his voice sounding distant. He needed anchor in the concrete, in affairs of state, before he could possibly navigate the personal abyss Anya had just opened. He focused on Khalid al-Mansur. Explain the Al-Hor project. Leave nothing out. Khalid nodded, a man used to laying out complex realities. In 1951, Britain was recovering from war, desperate for stable energy. King Edmund, then a young prince on a tour of the Caribbean, survived a plane crash due to the extraordinary courage of a local nurse, Miss Cecily Barrett. He vowed to her, "My family owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." It was a sentiment of the moment. But Miss Barrett was a woman of dignity, not a seeker of reward. Years later, in 1952, when her younger brother, a shrewd businessman, was part of a consortium negotiating oil rights in the then protected state of Al-Hor in the Gulf, she wrote to the king. She did not ask for money. She asked for his influence to ensure the consortium, which promised to funnel a significant portion of profits back into Jamaican infrastructure, was given fair hearing. The king, honoring his personal vow, used his considerable, albeit unofficial, influence. The deal was struck. It was phenomenally beneficial for Britain, securing oil at a fraction of the market cost for a decade. Sir Alistair picked up the thread, his voice weaving the past into the present. The arrangement was gentlemanly. A handshake across continents, rooted in a life saved. No legally binding covenants tied the crown to the consortium. But the memory of the promise and the king's intervention became part of the consortium's founding lore. Over generations, that consortium evolved, merged, and eventually became a significant part of the sovereign wealth structure I now advise, Khalid stated. The current board views the original agreement not as a lapse contract, but as a living moral covenant. With the ascension of a new monarch, they seek a renewal of that understanding. A simple public acknowledgement of the historic and valued partnership between the Crown and the founding partners of the Al-Hor Initiative would suffice. It would be a symbolic nod that the personal honor of the grandfather extends to the grandson. And without this nod, Alexander pressed, the king in waiting pushing past the shock. The terms of several current, critical supply agreements, which are legally sound but were cultivated in the spirit of that old handshake, would be revised to purely commercial, spot market rates upon their next review in 6 months, Khalid said calmly. The economic impact would be in the billions annually. It would be seen as a failure of diplomatic continuity. Your first year on the throne would be defined by an energy crisis with its roots in a forgotten act of chivalry. Alexander rose and walked to the window, looking out at the dark, quiet gardens. He was being asked to trade a piece of the monarchy's historical narrative for national stability, to publicly weave a thread of a secret history into the tapestry of the crown. And the nurse? Cecily Barrett? What became of her? She lived a long life in Kingston, Sir Alistair said. Never sought the limelight. Died in 2003. Her grandnephew is on the board that issued this request. The human story at the heart of the geopolitical puzzle was both beautiful and devastating. A life saved, a debt honored, a nation's prosperity altered, all now culminating in a quiet ultimatum on the eve of a coronation. Alexander felt the ghost of his grandfather in the room, a young, grateful man making a promise that would echo for generations. He turned back to the room, his gaze settling on Anya Sharma. The state's secret was vast, but it felt impersonal compared to the tightness in his chest when he looked at her. "And now," he said, the words sticking in his throat, "you speak of Eleanor. You speak of things I was shielded from." He could not keep the accusatory edge from his voice. "I was 17. I watched my family break. What could possibly have been withheld from that?" Anya drew a slow breath, her composure a thin veil over profound pain. "Your parents, Alex, were destroyed, absolutely shattered. In their grief, they made a decision, fueled by a desire to protect you, to protect the institution, and perhaps to protect their own memory of their daughter." The official report stated Eleanor lost control of her car on a wet country road. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Anya's eyes glistened. She wasn't alone in the car. The sentence landed like a physical weight on Alexander's chest. He gripped the back of a chair, his knuckles white. "She had a passenger," Anya continued, forcing the words out. "A young man, a student from college, someone your parents did not approve of. He was from a complicated background. His name was Leo. He survived the crash, but was critically injured. The decision was made at the highest levels to separate the incidents. Eleanor's death was a national tragedy. Leo's presence, the relationship, the potential scandal during a time of political sensitivity for your father. It was contained. He was treated privately, his family compensated, and a strict confidentiality agreement was put in place. He was moved abroad to recuperate. The story was simplified into a single, tragic accident for the princess." Alexander's mind reeled. His vibrant, rebellious sister had a secret love. Her death was not just her own, but a shared catastrophe that had been surgically edited. "Why?" he whispered, a storm of betrayal and confusion raging inside him. "Why tell me this? Why now?" "Because Leo is here," Anya said softly. "In London. He has spent his life living with this. He read about your coronation. He contacted me, the only link he had left to that time. He is not seeking anything. He simply wanted to be near the event that would have been a part of Eleanor's life. He wanted to pay his respects in his own way. When I learned of this other audience," she gestured Sir Alistair and Khalid, "I insisted on being included. You are about to carry the weight of a nation's secrets, Alex. But you should not carry a fabricated version of your own family's pain. You deserve to know that your sister's story was more than a headline. It was a love story that ended in tragedy, and that another person still grieves for her, silently, every day." Sir Alistair's aged voice filled the space. "I helped facilitate the arrangements for the young man's discretion at the time. It was deemed necessary for the crown's stability. Your father could not bear a public dissection of Eleanor's private life on top of his loss. It was a different time." Alexander felt a surge of anger, hot and cleansing. "A different time? You edited my sister out of her own death. You made her a two-dimensional tragedy." He stared at Anya, the friend he had trusted. "And you knew. All these years you knew. I promised your mother I would never tell you," Anya replied, tears finally escaping. She believed it would be a burden you should never have to bear. "But seeing you now about to take on the ultimate burden, I could not keep that promise. A king should not be built on lies, even loving ones. Especially loving ones." The room was a pressure cooker of history and heartbreak. Alexander was caught between two legacies, one of a grandfather's promise affecting millions, and one of a parent's protective lie affecting the very core of his being. The coronation tomorrow felt like a distant, frivolous dream. Here in this quiet room, he was being forced to decide what kind of sovereign, what kind of man he would be. Would he acknowledge the hidden debts of the past, both geopolitical and personal, or would he continue the tradition of elegant silence? The audience was no longer something being granted to the three guests. It had become a trial for the future king himself, and the verdict would shape his reign from its very first hour. The clocks ticking now felt like a hammer striking the anvil of the silence. Alexander stood between the two truths, feeling their gravitational pull. On one side, the vast, cold machinery of state and history. On the other, the raw, intimate wound of family. He felt a strange clarity descend upon him, the kind that comes when there are no good choices, only necessary ones. He addressed Khalid al-Mansour first, his voice regaining a measure of its steadiness, though it was thinner, worn. This acknowledgement you seek. It must be generic. It cannot mention names or specific projects. I will agree to a line in my first Christmas broadcast, speaking of the enduring gratitude for partnerships formed in the challenging years after the war, whose legacy of cooperation continues to benefit the nation. Will that suffice as a renewal of the understanding? Khalid considered for a moment, then gave a slow, single nod. It will. The right people will hear the signal in those words. The continuity will be acknowledged. The agreements will stand. He paused. It is a wise solution, Your Royal Highness. It honors the spirit without compromising the present. One storm, temporarily navigated. But it left Alexander feeling hollow, as if he'd just traded a piece of his integrity for a ledger sheet. He turned his full attention to Anya and Sir Alistair, the personal now demanding its due. Where is he? Alexander asked, his voice rough. Where is Leo? Anya seemed to brace herself. He is staying at a small hotel in Kensington. He wanted only to see the processions from a distance, to feel a connection. I want to see him, Alexander stated. It was not a request. Sir Alistair stirred. Sir, I must advise against it. The security implications, the risk of exposure on the eve of the coronation. I am not yet king, Alexander interrupted, a flash of the man beneath the title showing through. Until the crown is on my head tomorrow, I am, for a few more hours, a brother who has just learned his sister's death was half a story. I will see him. You will arrange it. Discreetly. The command in his voice was new, born not from protocol, but from a deep, personal imperative. Anya, seeing his resolve, simply nodded. Sir Alistair, after a long look at Alexander's face, sighed a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades of similar secrets. It can be done, but it must be swift, and it must be now. 15 minutes later, Alexander found himself in the back of a discreet, unmarked vehicle, Anya beside him. Sir Alistair and Khalid remained at the palace. The statecraft part of the evening concluded. The car slid through the back streets, away from the grand thoroughfares being prepared for tomorrow's spectacle. The normality of London at night, late-night cafes, couples laughing, students heading home, felt surreal against the tectonic shifts happening in his soul. The hotel was unassuming, a townhouse converted into a boutique establishment. Anya led him to a room on the third floor. She knocked softly. The door opened. The man who stood there was in his late 40s, with a tired, intelligent face and kind, sad eyes. He bore no physical resemblance to Eleanor, but Alexander felt her presence in the room immediately, in the quiet pain that emanated from the stranger. Leo's eyes widened slightly in recognition and shock. Your Royal Highness, he began, stumbling back a step. No, Alexander said, stepping inside. Not here. Not for this. I am Alexander, Eleanor's brother. The simple statement seemed to undo Leo. His composure cracked, and he gestured weakly towards a small sitting area. Anya remained by the door, a silent witness. She talked about you all the time, Leo said, his voice thick with a British accent that held a faint trace of something else. Eastern European, perhaps. She called you her little anchor. Said you were the only one in the family who didn't take it all so seriously. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Alexander sat, the familiar nickname a dagger to his heart. They never told me about you. They weren't supposed to, Leo replied, looking down at his hands. My family, we were newcomers. There were associations, wrong place, wrong time, from the old country. Nothing proven, but enough for the palace to deem it an unsuitable connection. Eleanor didn't care. We were just two students. That night, we'd had an argument. About the future. About the impossibility of it all. She was upset. She drove too fast. The rain, it was my fault. It was an accident, Alexander said firmly, the words automatic, but he realized he meant them. Hearing this man, seeing his enduring guilt, made the story three-dimensional. It was no longer a tabloid scandal waiting to happen, but a human tragedy. She was a strong-willed person. You couldn't have controlled her. Leo looked up, gratitude and agony mingling in his eyes. I was in a coma for weeks. When I woke up, it was all over. The funeral had been. I was told, in no uncertain terms, that my silence was the final gift I could give her. That to speak would tarnish her memory, turn her into a spectacle. So I vanished. I built a life. I teach history at a small university in Canada. But I never stopped. Alexander felt his anger towards his parents, towards the system, soften into a profound, weary sadness. He saw the logic of their devastating choice. In their shattered state, they had tried to protect Eleanor's memory from becoming a public feast and to protect their surviving son from a media hurricane. They had chosen a clean, public grief over a messy, private truth. He couldn't forgive it. Not yet, but he began to understand it. Do you have family? Alexander asked. A wife. 2 children. They know I lost someone very dear in an accident before I met them. They don't know who. Leo took a deep breath. I don't want anything. Truly. Coming here was selfish, perhaps. I just needed to be in the same city, to see the flags, to feel for a moment that I wasn't completely erased from that part of her story. Alexander stood. He walked to the window, looking out at the anonymous street. He was making decisions tonight that would define his reign. Here was another one. You loved her, he said, not turning around. With all my heart, came the quiet, certain reply. Then, you are a part of this family's history, whether it is recorded or not, Alexander said, turning to face him. The silence ends with me. Not publicly. That would only cause fresh pain. But privately. You will be included in the memorial foundation we set up in her name. You will be sent invitations to private family memorials if you wish to attend. Your children, should they ever wish to know more about the woman their father loved, will have a channel. You will not be a secret anymore. Not to the crown. Leo was speechless, tears streaming silently down his face. He nodded, unable to form words. Alexander walked over and did something he had never done with a stranger. He offered his hand. Leo took it, his grip firm. It was a compact, not of state, but of shared memory. Back in the car, heading to the palace, Alexander was silent. Anya watched him. That was a brave thing to do, she said softly. It was just, he replied. He felt exhausted, scraped raw, but for the first time that night, he also felt a strange sense of alignment. He had faced 2 hidden truths and had not looked away. He had negotiated with the past on his own terms. As the palace gates loomed ahead, he spoke again. Tomorrow, I will be crowned. I will make vows to serve the nation. But tonight, I have learned that to serve the nation, I must first reconcile its and my own hidden stories. I cannot lead from a place of curated fiction. He returned to the green drawing room. Sir Alistair and Khalid were gone, their business concluded. Only Eleanor, his secretary, waited, her face lined with concern. Sir, the rehearsal for the Abbey procession is in a few hours. I know, Alexander said. He felt 100 years older than the man who had left this room earlier. But he also felt more real, more substantial. The crown tomorrow would be an immense weight. But he now knew its weight was not just gold and jewels. It was made of promises kept and broken, of loves hidden, of debts moral and financial, of a history far messier and more human than the official portraits showed. He had met the ghosts, and he had not blinked. He was as ready as he would ever be. The pre-dawn hours found Alexander in his private chapel, a small, stone-ribbed space within the palace walls. He had not slept. The conversations of the night played on a loop in his mind. The rustle of Sir Alistair's voice, the calm precision of Khalid, the devastating softness of Anya's revelations, and the profound sadness in Leo's eyes. The scent of old incense and polished wood was a stark contrast to the metallic taste of secrets that still lingered on his tongue. He knelt not in piety, but in search of quiet, trying to separate the man from the monarch about to be born. The weight felt different now. It was no longer an abstract burden of duty, but a specific, granular load. It was the weight of Cecily Barrett's bravery, of his grandfather's grateful promise, of oil flowing through pipelines laid by a handshake. It was the weight of his sister's laughter, her secret love, a skid on a wet road, and his parents' world-shattering decision to hide a part of her story to save the rest. These were the bricks of the invisible foundation upon which the throne sat. Tomorrow, the world would see the guilt and the ceremony. Only he would feel the rough, unfinished texture of the truth beneath. His private secretary, Eleanor, found him there as the first gray light filtered through the stained glass. "Sir," she said, her voice respectfully low, "it's time to prepare." Her use of the word prepare felt immense. It wasn't just about dressing. It was about armoring up. The morning was a blur of controlled chaos, but Alexander moved through it with a new, detached focus. The meticulous bath, the dressing and the complex layers of historic uniform. Each item held a new resonance. The sash was not just silk. It was a thread connecting him to generations who had also carried hidden stories. The sword at his side was not just for show. It was a symbol of the difficult cuts and decisions he had already begun to make. In a quiet moment, as tailors made final adjustments, he asked Eleanor to summon the keeper of the privy purse and the head of communications. They arrived, puzzled at the unscheduled meeting on such a day. "Two directives," Alexander said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "First, initiate a quiet, thorough review of all historical correspondence and informal accord from my grandfather's reign, specifically relating to the Caribbean and the Gulf region in the early 1950s. I want it compiled in a single private dossier for my eyes only." The officials exchanged a glance, but nodded. "Second, draft a paragraph for inclusion in the Christmas broadcast draft. The theme is gratitude and legacy. I want a line acknowledging the courage of ordinary individuals in extraordinary times, and the enduring value of partnerships forged not just in halls of power, but in moments of shared humanity. Ensure it is seamless." The Christmas broadcast line was the coded acknowledgement for Khalid and the shadowy consortium. The historical review was for himself. He would no longer rule in ignorance of the crown's hidden entanglements. The officials withdrew, leaving him to his thoughts. He had just performed his first two sovereign acts, both born from the secret audience. The procession to Westminster Abbey was a symphony of color and sound, a roaring river of goodwill. Alexander sat in the diamond Jubilee state coach, waving automatically his smile a practiced mask. But behind the eyes, he was elsewhere. He saw not just the cheering crowds, but the intricate web of history that held them all. The pensioner whose heating bill was indirectly tied to an old king's debt of honor. The immigrant family whose story was as complex as Leo's, the old veterans who had served a crown that carried such secrets. The monarchy was not just a family. It was the central knot in a vast, tangled net of national life, much of it unseen. Inside the abbey, the air was thick with expectation and incense. The ancient liturgy began, a rolling thunder of words and music that had crowned kings and queens for a millennium. As he walked slowly down the nave, he felt the gaze of the assembled VIPs, world leaders, and family. His eyes found his mother in the gallery. Her face was a portrait of pride and strain. He thought of the secret she had kept, the pain she had buried to, in her mind, protect him. He gave her a slow, slight nod, not a royal acknowledgement, but a son's signal. He saw her eyes widen, then soften with a confusion that held a glimmer of understanding. A tiny thread of the hidden truth was silently communicated and accepted. Then, the moment. The archbishop presented him to the people. The historic question echoed. "Do you solemnly promise and swear to govern the peoples according to their respective laws and customs?" The words, "I solemnly promise," left his lips, and they felt different. They were not just a vow to a constitution, but a vow to the full, unvarnished truth of the role he was entering. He was promising to govern a nation with all its visible glory and its invisible, often painful, wiring. The anointing behind a screen was the most sacred part. As the holy oil touched his head, hands, and breast, he felt a chilling, then a warming sensation. It was not divine inspiration, but a profound acceptance. He was being set apart, yes, but not made perfect. He was being anointed with the knowledge of his own humanity and the flawed human institution he was now leading. The weight of the crown, when the archbishop lifted St. Edward's crown high and then brought it down upon his head, was immense. Physically, it was over 2 kilograms of solid gold. Spiritually, it was everything from a night before and everything from centuries past. But he was ready for it. He had been prepared not by the rehearsals, but by the audience. He rose, turned, and faced the abbey, now King Alexander. The trumpets blared, the congregation shouted, "God save the king," and the sound was a physical wave. In that pinnacle of public triumph, his mind held a private quiet. He had met the ghosts, and they had not broken him. They had, instead, given him a sober strength. The coronation was a magnificent pageant, a necessary story told to the nation. But his real inauguration had happened in the quiet of the green drawing room. He now ruled not from fairy tale, but from a reality he finally, fully saw. The roar from the abbey faded into the solemn pealing of bells across London, a sound that seemed to wash the city in a wave of history. King Alexander processed back to Buckingham Palace, the crown heavy on his brow, the orb and scepter strange, symbolic weights in his hands. The crowds along the mall were a blur of joyful faces and fluttering flags, but his inner world was preternaturally still. The secret audience had carved out a private chamber within his consciousness, a place of stark truth that existed alongside the public spectacle. The balcony appearance was the final, iconic act. Flanked by his family, with the new queen consort at his side, he looked down at the sea of subjects. The cheers were deafening, a physical force of acceptance and hope. He waved, smiled, and performed the timeless ritual. But as his eyes swept over the thousands, he saw them differently. He saw not just a monolithic crowd, but a million individual stories, each with its own hidden chapters, its own private debts and loves and losses. His monarchy, he understood in that moment, would have to make space for that complexity. It could no longer present only a flawless facade. The doors closed on the balcony, and the private world of the palace enveloped them again. The first gathering in the staterooms was for the core family. Champagne was poured, but the atmosphere was strained, electric with the unspoken. His mother approached him, her eyes searching his. The public mask of the dignified queen mother was gone, replaced by the anxious parent. "Alexander," she began, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the room. "You're not in the abbey?" She left the question hanging. He guided her gently to a relatively quiet alcove. "I know, mother," he said softly, using the intimate term. "About Leo. Anya told me last night." All the color drained from her face. For a terrifying second, he thought she might faint. She gripped his arm, her fingers trembling. We only wanted to protect you. To protect her memory. The press would have torn it apart, turned her love into a sordid, "I know why you did it," he interrupted, not unkindly. He placed his hand over hers, the crown ring cold against her skin. "And I'm not going to reveal it, but the silence within this family ends now." He was a part of her life. He has grieved for her, alone, for 22 years. That deserves our acknowledgement, if only in private. I have seen him. I have offered him a place in her memorial foundation. Tears filled her eyes, not of regal sorrow, but of a mother's profound, complicated grief finally, finding a crack in the dam she had built around it. She nodded silently, unable to speak, squeezing his hand. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of a new, more honest understanding. A hidden fracture in the family's foundation had been gently exposed to the air, beginning the slow process of healing rather than festering in the dark. Later, in his first official meeting as king, a brief, formal receiving of the prime minister and the leader of the opposition, the conversation was all about the day's triumph, the unifying power of the monarchy. Alexander listened, nodded, made the appropriate remarks. But as they spoke of national unity, his mind was on the specific, divisive secrets he now held. Unity, he realized, was not about everyone knowing the same story, but about the institution being honest enough to bear the weight of the stories that were different. In the evening, a state banquet was held. Alexander sat at the head of the table, the imperial state crown glittering under the chandeliers. The guest list was a who's who of global power. His gaze traveled down the table and found Khalid al-Mansur, seated appropriately far down, a nod to his influence without drawing undue attention. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Khalid gave an almost imperceptible inclination of his head. The deal, the acknowledgement, was sealed. A crisis had been averted with a sentence yet to be spoken. It was his first tangible act of statecraft, born from the secret audience.